Corey Hinton and Doliwiz, Nujayao, Portland, Nuda Begs, Zibayeg, Nagabalungs, Nagamyuks, Beskudamagad Nil. My name's Corey Hinton. I live in Portland. I'm from the place at the edge of the water, the Francis family. I'm past Makwadi. I am very happy to be here today to moderate this all-star panel. Thank you to everybody for sticking around and for being here after a really long, hot day. Truly grateful to have a full house here. We have an all-star panel. I'm going to turn it to my panelists for some brief introductions, and then we'll get right into the topic. Donna?
Good afternoon. I'm Donna Loring, Penobscot Nation tribal member and elder. I served in the Maine State Legislature for, I'm going to say, about 13 years. I also served as aide-de-camp to Governor Angus King and senior advisor to Janet Mills. Not used to introducing myself. Corey. But, so, Darren?
Oh, yeah. Thanks. Thank you, Donna. My name is Darren Ranco. I'm a Penobscot Nation citizen. I'm chair of Native American Programs and professor of anthropology at the University of Maine. I also serve as executive director for the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship, and I'm on a host of boards and past boards, and I'm a dog dad to 3 small dogs, and I'm also a Libra, so I'll argue both sides of it. Whatever you put me forward to think about, Corey, I'll do it.
Thank you. For the record, the agenda that we all agreed upon had Corey reading the bios and introductions for our panelists. We were informed that the panelists were to introduce themselves, though. These were the instructions that I was given by the management here. I'm not in charge. I'm just the moderator.
Is this democracy or sovereignty in action?
As I said earlier, we're only talking about democracy. This itself is not a democracy. But thank you again, everybody, for being here. Just to reorient ourselves to the panel, our topic is recognizing sovereignty as a stepping stone to an enduring democracy. Here, we're, of course, talking about Indigenous sovereignty and the sovereignty that is exercised by Indigenous sovereign nations, tribal nations, Indian tribes. There's a bunch of terms for these types of nations. But before I turn it to our panelists for their comments on this topic, when we talk about sovereignty, it's a word that can sometimes mean different things to different people. It's a word that as a lawyer I find challenging to employ for a lot of different reasons, but generally what we're talking about is the ability of a nation to govern itself, to self-govern, to create laws based on customs, values, and traditions, to legislate those laws, in other words, to write them down, to authorize people to enforce those laws, and to create tribunals and panels of people to review the decisions about how those laws are enforced. Sovereignty is the exercise of that type of power, and it's also an important reflection of who a people are. There's ways that Indigenous sovereignty has influenced the shape of this place called the United States of America and other nations around the world, and that's what we're here to talk about today. There's many ways that our Indigenous nations have influenced the formation of the United States and many ways that they can influence and be stepping stones to enduring democracies, and we'll get into some of that here over the next 40 minutes or so. Donna, I'd first like to turn it to you. You've got the floor.
So what am I supposed to talk about? I'm supposed to define sovereignty, what I think sovereignty is?
I just tried to do that for you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so sovereignty, I did a series in my radio show on sovereignty, and it was like a 2-part series. I think we had like 19 shows on it, because it's not that simple. And we kind of peel the layers off in it, and there are different, I guess the original meaning of the word was like a sovereign king, or sort of like a English king or French king, or there's no power above the ruler. So when we come down to tribal state relationships, we always run into the problem that the state sees the tribes as competing, or maybe will do something harmful to their position, or so they really, to this day, they have not recognized our status on sovereignty. So I'm just going to say that and keep it simple. Go ahead, Darren.
Thanks, Donna. Thanks, Corey. And I find the topic actually really challenging that we've tasked for ourselves for today. I believe there is some tension between what most people consider democracy, which is people voting, and sort of that, and what has appeared as, certain kinds of democracies around the world in the last couple hundred years. And then the exercise, the true exercise of what I would say is tribal sovereignty. And I think I would prefer we say tribal sovereignty and not just say the word sovereignty, because that has its own European supremacy kind of context to it. And I'm sure we'll get more into this. But I also think that the term democracy has, if the goal of democracy is sort of, us being, I'm going to define it in a way that people would never define democracy outside of this context. If we would think of democracy as that we are in relationship with one another and that we are ensuring each other's sort of well-being and freedom, then I think there's a lot that Indigenous nations, through our cultural traditions and through our confederacies and those sorts of things, have a lot to say about democracy, and therefore the exercise of our sovereignty and through tribal sovereignty is the way forward through interrelationship and proper relationship, not only between different human societies or nations or states, but between humans and non-humans. And I think, for us as Wabanaki people, as Indigenous people, to kind of think through both the contours of democracy and the contours of our sovereignty, those have to be really centered. If I were to say, what is the promise of American democracy vis-a-vis our nations, I find that a really troubling and challenging space, right? That, right from the beginning, the sovereignty of the United States and the Marshall cases, right, it puts us from fully sovereign to domestic dependent nations, right? So takes away from us in a very specific way. Those cases being decided at the same time. The state of Maine is becoming a state and also furthering that and making us wards and that sort of thing. So, that idea of ensuring relationship and freedom as a goal of democracy, and then the exercise of United Statesian democracy onto us as Indigenous people, I find those to be very tense, in trying to understand them. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that. I think that's also and Donna thinking so deeply about the tribal state relations, that's so important. So I don't know if that's an opening statement. I wanted to cite a bunch of different people. They wouldn't let me have like 40 PowerPoint slides, where I would professor it up. So that's my opening statement.
I wanted Darren to have all the PowerPoint slides that he could. That also was not my call. But this is a complicated topic, and I appreciate what you both have said. And I'd like to kind of focus in on one word you used there, Darren, which is freedom. It's July. And last week was the 4th of July, which is when the United States of America celebrates its independence. Native Americans have served in the United States military at a greater rate than any other group. And I'd like to talk for a moment, and Donna, maybe you can reflect a little bit on how Wabanaki nations, maybe in particular, or Indigenous nations more broadly, have contributed to freedom in this country from a military, a diplomatic perspective. Thinking about treaties, and you're a veteran yourself. Anything you'd like to say about that topic, Donna?
Well, what I was going to say is, I'll address what you asked me. But a lot of people don't equate George Washington with Indians, right? So there's a guy named Colin Calloway who wrote a book called The Indian World of George Washington. And we started out our sovereignty series with Colin as a guest and Professor Harold Prince as the other guest. Now, about George Washington, he had a hobby that he really spent a lot of his time doing, and that was surveying land. He loved to survey land. And George Washington and Hamilton and Henry Knox, that group, and Thomas Jefferson, actually what they wanted to do was to create a nation. And so when George Washington looked east, he saw the past. And when he looked west, he saw the future. So in order to create a great nation, you have to be able to build villages and create states. And what do you need for that? You need land. And who had the land? Native people had the lands. And they had to go over those lands. They had to take those lands one way or the other. And in doing that, they devised ways of getting that land. And a lot of it created wars with the tribes. And in the East, we fought wars for over 200 years. So veterans, I'm finally getting to it. Native people, and I'm going to, some of them joined the military for patriotic reasons. Many of them joined the military to survive because there was just nothing there, nothing on their reserves, no economic opportunities, no infrastructure. So a lot of Native people were already in the military, and I'm going to say World War II. They were already in the military when World War II started. And a majority, probably the highest amount of veterans or people serving in the military were Native people that joined to fight, proportionate to their numbers. There are, I think it was in 1942, Bangor Daily News had a big spread in the headlines, and it had pictures of all the veterans, Penobscot veterans, Passamaquoddy veterans. And the Penobscot veterans had, I think, one woman, and the Passamaquoddy had like two. So there were like 3 women in the military even back then. So yeah, I joined the military. I'm a veteran. Served in Vietnam. But during World War II, when our Native veterans served, they served with fellow veterans who would be friends for the rest of their lives. They bonded. And after that service, there was 1 or 2 that became attorneys, and we reached out to them for help in the land claims. So, when you look at the service and the people that we meet, it helped us in that way. So I'm not going to go any further into that, but.
Thanks, Donna.
Sure.
Darren, you want to comment on, any reactions to that or any other ways? You've studied this issue pretty deeply. Any comments from you?
I mean, I'm not a veteran, so I feel a little out of position. I do think that Donna always makes fun of me that I'll answer anything, honestly. So I think that idea of serving, my dad was a veteran, fought in Korea, and I think coming from reservation environments and serving, it's a lot of things, as Donna mentioned. I think it's referenced in some really famous diplomatic speeches too, like the Mitchell speech to the legislature in 1887, and as well as the Passamaquoddy letter resisting the Citizenship Act. Both reference our role in fighting beside Americans in these various wars, but they also make the very clear connection that and it's very much a kind of Wabanaki diplomacy kind of articulation that as a way to say we're not threatening to you on some level, but we are also, when they make those pronouncements that we have fought beside you in each of these wars, they also, in both that famous Lewis Mitchell speech and the Passamaquoddy letter resisting citizenship, they also say we want our own. We have our own nation. We gladly make the ultimate sacrifice with you, but we are still our own. And so that articulation can be hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around. Like, why is that a consistent theme in these speeches and letters? And I think that's part of the really interesting tension that we face in the panel today, which is, on the one hand, trying to participate on some level or in concert with our neighbors in making these sacrifices, and then on the other hand saying we don't agree to the social contract that you're forcing upon us at the same time.
Great, thank you. Donna, you want to add something to that?
Not right now.
Okay. I'm going to throw something out there. Date today is, July 13th. July 19th is the date that the Treaty of Watertown was signed, and in 1776, just a couple of weeks after the Declaration of Independence. And I think, Darren, to your really important note there, as I've studied the notes from that convention, the transcripts, the Declaration of Independence was actually brought to the place where the Watertown Treaty was being negotiated and read for the reactions of the chiefs. And so I'm just curious, in that moment, that was sort of diplomatic relations existing on a parallel track to American democracy coming into focus. But could either of you comment on, and Darren, I'll push this to you first, the importance of the diplomacy in that moment and the geopolitical contributions that were being made as literally the 4th of July and the Declaration of Independence were being signed?
Yeah, no, and it's an important question because so much of this, it's so context-driven, like these histories of like how we as Wabanaki people have participated and shaped, probably more importantly, shaped this era, the Revolutionary War period, as an era. And I think, right in the Declaration of Independence, of course, on the one hand, you have, and I post this on Facebook every year, like there's the whole language of Indian savages in the Declaration of Independence. I don't know if you know that part. It's really fun, like referring to us as savages.
Merciless savages.
Merciless savages, sorry. And then on the other hand, there is, especially for us as Wabanaki, basically being at various times in a hot and cold war with England for 150 years, basically, how we respond to that moment in, a new order of being in the context of what becomes the United States. So, I think you have to understand it from the diplomacies that are being brought to that space and had been for, at least 150 years of diplomacies and treaty makings with not just the English, but the French as well, and sort of how that's gone down. So I really, I think always thinking from our perspective in that space, then you see like what is our context. Like we engage in that space. Even at the same time they're calling us savages, right? Engaging, helping in the war effort in significant ways, and the whole Colonel Allen letter and the Passamaquoddy and the guiding. I mean, all of those histories are so critical to the success of the Americans, especially in the North. I think that's undeniable. And, the flip side of that could be said, all of those sacrifices for us as Wabanaki, how is that rewarded or not rewarded in the aftermath of the creation of the Constitution, where, so much of Confederacy ideas from both Wabanaki and Haudenosaunee people shaped especially the Articles of Confederation. There was no model of sort of how different states can work together and form a peaceful relation with one another that was existing in Europe at the time. It was our confederacies that were, in the famous, writings of Ben Franklin visiting the Haudenosaunee, but again, Washington and Allen, and they all knew our confederacy as well. So, I find the tensions of that diplomatic space where we participate because, we share an enemy, so we are kind of friends. How does that work? And then how does that shift in the next, after after 1783 through the Constitution, and then for us up here, of course, the move from Massachusetts statehood to Maine statehood, and that at the end of the day, and I've made this statement in a number of other ways, that image for the settlers and colonists of us as merciless savages, though, wins. Like they don't see us as diplomatic partners, they see us as less than, and they put us into wardship roles, even though they are so dependent upon our sacrifices through the revolutionary period. So, call those broken promises, call them whatever you want. But I think that idea, why are we there, that's us shaping the landscape in really significant ways in that period.
Thanks, Darren. Donna, anything you want to follow up on there?
Yep. So in 1795, Chief Orono was in Boston, the Boston area, and the Battle of Bunker Hill was going on. And he took that time, that moment, to do a little diplomacy because, the Americans really needed the Penobscot and the Wabanaki to come in on their side. And so Chief Orono basically made sure that they would recognize Penobscot land and hunting areas and fishing rights and all that. And that's where the original treaty started, was in 1775. Now, 1776, I believe, was the Watertown Treaty. So it all of that was negotiated around helping the United States, the revolutionaries, to win the war. And we looked at it as a way to maintain our lands. So that's where diplomacy came in there. Yeah.
Thanks, Donna. I'd like to kind of push this conversation in almost like a political science type direction, if we could, and start to talk about democratic institutions, what they look like today, and how Wabanaki nations or indigenous nations as a whole, through governance structures, through customs, traditions, how can we say, or how do you think that indigenous peoples and their governance structures have influenced governing structures in this country or otherwise? Or do you disagree with that statement? And I don't know who wants to go first. I'd turn it to either of you. We all know Darren wants to go.
Yeah, I want to. So I set this up. Donna wanted me to go. I mentioned that the idea of again, that framework of multiple sovereigns, the federalist system, I think is undeniably a concept, taken and modified from our confederacies as Indigenous people. And ironically, or not ironically, I feel like this is like an Alanis Morissette song, maybe, I don't know. Is it irony? I'm not sure. The idea that at its core, tribal nations are one of the three sovereigns recognized in our Constitution. I don't think most civics courses and instruction teaches it that way. So I think that that's also that silencing and imposition of racialized and superiority categories kind of plays into that. But also the idea that we, as tribal nations, right, have not been in control because of colonization entirely in control of our own civic cultural institutions because of colonization, right? I mean, that becomes particularly salient in Maine when basically we're forced into democracy. See, that's where another tension, right? Voting for our leadership, in the early parts of Maine statehood, right? Where we were being prevented from choosing our own leaders from our own cultural frameworks. So I think, again, these takings and the elements and ongoing sort of colonial frames have severely impacted our ability to maintain that civic culture through our clan systems, through our traditional ways of decision making. Not gonna, too many different tribal members and citizens from different tribes. Not gonna say who does this the best or the worst. I mean, we are all facing the challenge of that imposition and erosion of our civic culture that is traditional to us. And then we also have a very, hope springs eternal. Many people in these institutions that have colonial frameworks that drive them, we are also indigenizing them, right? We are also, in possible ways, through our natural resource or environmental programs, through our educational systems, have opportunities, although limited, to bring back and center that civic culture in our decision making. So, I used to teach a class when Colin Calloway was my boss at Dartmouth College. I used to teach a class on tribal governments, and I posed it to my students. Is this system just so colonial that there's no way of indigenizing it, or are there ways through this framework where we seek more and more control over it, and make our civic cultures the core of what our current tribal governments look like? So I think that's that same tension, like democracy for us was forced on us, not a social contract that we chose in terms of how we chose our leaders, and yet now we face this conundrum of this putting this imposition onto us in the colonial structure, making it reflect our civic culture and values. And I think that's a lot of the work that goes on in our tribal governments today. And I think it's, I don't know, I'm a hopeful person. It's weird being like when I teach 20-year-olds and I'm 50-something, and just recently 50-something. Anyway, the idea that I'm the most hopeful, like, am I the dreamer, like I've been beaten down by the world, enough times, but that idea that we can make or modify or do something with these institutions that have this colonial framing, this forced democracy, how do we see our, the 7 generations out and who we are in them? I think it's the challenge.
Thanks, Darren. Donna, I have a topic question for you, unless you want to respond.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, go for it, please.
So first of all, Constitution. Let's look at that Constitution. What's it written by? It's written by middle-class white men. And Indian people, I mean, we are mentioned in it, yes, but, but not in a good way. And the fact that we are still here. We're still here. And it's really, it's kind of miraculous, given the fact that we have to live under these rules and regulations by a government that really is trying to eradicate us every day. So that's a up note. So I guess I'm not going to go any further than that.
That's fine. I want to try to turn the conversation maybe a little bit more locally. My day-to-day job is as a lawyer working with tribal nations all over the United States. And I see how tribal nations are able to work and shape their own backyards, exercising their form of tribal sovereignty. And I know that here in Maine, and all of us probably know that it's not the same here in Maine. The ability of the nations here to positively influence this place is not the same as it might exist elsewhere. And Donna, I'm wondering if you can just reflect on the situation here in Maine and some of those differences and what they mean to this conversation.
Thought you'd never ask. First of all, let's look at the when Maine became a state, 1820. Maine became a state. When Maine became a state, they agreed to do some things for Massachusetts. It's called the Articles of Separation. And they agreed to take over the treaties that Massachusetts had signed with the tribes. So that was one of the things that Maine said that they would do to become a state. There's another thing they said, because this was during this was a Missouri Compromise. State of Maine said, okay, Maine said, sure, we'll come in as a state on the anti-slavery side. And there was a lot of argument about that nationwide, because one of the things they pushed back on was, well, how can you become an anti-slave state? Look at the way you're treating your Indians. And that's true. I mean, that was in the papers in Philadelphia at the time. So Maine came in with one thing in mind. They wanted to be a state. They wanted to fulfill the obligations of the Articles of Separation that Massachusetts required for them to do. Part of that was they would sign a treaty with the tribes. So in 1820, they signed a treaty with Penobscot. And Penobscot signed that treaty with the thought of preserving their hunting grounds and what little land they had left, including 4 townships up north. It was their hunting area. And Maine signed it with the thought, well, we're fulfilling our obligations to Massachusetts, and once we sign that, then these tribes are going to be under our guardianship, and they're going to do what we tell them to do. They'll be right under our control. So there are 2 different ways of looking at this treaty, so to speak. We've been in litigation over those misunderstandings ever since day one. So that's all I have to say about the 1820 situation.
Thanks, Donna. Darren, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just again, just building on the Maine state constitution as well, and again, just reminding me of this tension between democracy, forced democracy, sovereignty, and freedom. Those tensions are right there in the state constitution. I've made the argument that in the electors section of the state constitution, there's a category of people who cannot vote, and the category is Indians not taxed. So what does that mean? It means not Indians. Indians conceivably could vote, although rules quickly developed by the state of Maine made that almost impossible. But in the Constitution, that idea of Indians not taxed, there's only 5 other states in the United States that actually has that as a category in its state constitution. And legally, we know, and this is confirmed many times in the next couple of hundred years from 1820, is that Indians not taxed is a kind of recognition of sovereignty. It's a recognition that Indians in their own political system, would have their own taxes, presumably, or some version of that. And that, because it didn't exactly racialize it. It didn't say, you're an Indian, you can't vote. It said, Indians not taxed. So that contour of a recognition of sovereignty, on the one hand, and tying it to citizenship on the other, right, of being able to vote as a fundamental piece of citizenship. I'm not saying the US or state of Maine constitutions weren't already playing fast and free with who and who could not vote and what that meant. I'm merely pointing that out. The problem becomes quite quickly and early on, and this is sort of cemented in Murch v. Tomer in 1843, or 1842.
42.
The idea that it quickly becomes, the emphasis becomes just like you could emphasize this in the Declaration of Independence, is our savage quality, not our not taxed quality, right? So the state of Maine, right in 1820, 1821, starts to make all these rules, making us impossible to vote, making us as wards of the state in as significant a way as possible, et cetera, taking these 4 townships in the 1830s. We know the rest. And then by 1842, calling us imbeciles that can't, seemingly care for ourselves or sign, although they did say in that case that we could, if we signed a contract, we would be held liable for it. So we're not total imbeciles, ironically in that case. But the idea that the implications of that is not the not taxed. They don't emphasize that. They emphasize the Indian, the merciless savage, treat us as such, as less than, and continue to take and provide this wardship kind of framework to us. And so I think that's that tension, or that, again, how we are brought into the democracy of the state of Maine is patently absurd in the way that, on the one hand, are they recognizing our sovereignty, and then also these treaties and the Articles of Separation, which Mainers said, yeah, put that back in the Constitution, yay, yay. But I mean, that idea that is sort of the fundamentals of why this panel is so important, but also troubling.
I almost forgot what I was going to say. Okay, so the Constitution, Maine Constitution, had this thing, this obligation in Article 10, Section 5, written in it, and we've basically revisited that in the past year or so. The state of Maine has, because what happened was that they took that written section out of the Constitution. Even though Maine still was obligated, they took it out so that, and if you wanted to see it, you'd have to maybe go to the library to read that. So if you had a printed copy of the Maine Constitution, you would not see that article of obligation from Maine to the tribes. So they did a really smart thing there. I mean, they didn't want people to read it all the time. Let's say for schools or whatever, they didn't want people to read it, so they just said we won't print it. But it's still going to be in effect, even though we're not printing it. So when you think about that, when you think about the Constitution, a Constitution for a state or a government defines how they're going to how they're going to work, the structure of their government. And when they take that out, then, you know, things like court decisions and classes on history or whatever, they don't see that. And Maine's obligation to the tribes just becomes invisible. So just recently, we had a long sessions in the legislature about printing that, putting that back into print. And every office, you know, the Secretary of State said, yeah. Attorney General said, yeah. The executive said, no. So there was a referendum, and for the first time, the people actually won something. And that got put back. It is now in the Maine Constitution, and you can now read it. You don't have to go to a separate place to see that. So those are my 2 points that I wanted to make.
Thanks, Donna. We've got a couple minutes left before we go to some questions from the audience. But I'm just going to ask this question. Donna, you just talked about how so many branches of the state government supported restoring the treaty obligations. The people of the state support restoring Maine's treaty obligations. But the governor opposed that, and the governors opposed many recent attempts to modernize the Settlement Act to recognize Wabanaki sovereignty. What does that mean about the strength of this kind of democracy, where it's okay to maintain that difference that we've talked about?
Well, the kind of democracy we have, I mean, you have the right to do what the governor did, which was a veto. The people have a right to override that veto in either House or the Senate, which did not happen, by the way. But still, that's democracy. That's what we live in. And, you know, we all have our rights. And a lot of times we don't get what we want. But, you know, that's fair. We're not always going to get what we want. But the tribal nations, in their quest for sovereignty in Maine, have always been denied that recognition. And we've been denied that recognition because the state of Maine sees sovereignty as a scary word, a scary concept, that the tribes are going to be an equal power to the state or over the state in some aspects. And this is not true. And there's always, you know, there's different kinds of sovereignties. And there's, you know, you can negotiate sovereignty. You know, it's just it's not a one thing or the other, which the state sees this as. And I think that we're moving forward, educating people about this, and hopefully by the time we bring in the next governor, the state will recognize our sovereign rights.
Hell yeah. Do we have any questions from the audience? Do we have those now, or?
Is this on? It's not very loud. We'll have the ushers collect the cards or any remaining cards and bring those up to the stage, please.
Yeah, that's fine. So while we're waiting for those, just sort of in reflection on what you just said, Donna, I'm sure that there are many allies in this room. I know that there are allies of the Wabanaki nations. I'm wondering if you can both maybe put something out to the group in terms of ways that they can support the Wabanaki nations fight for proper recognition of our sovereignty. Darren, do you mind commenting first?
Yeah, I mean, of course, and I saw some of you at a really great event on Thursday evening supporting the Wabanaki Alliance, which is been, for us as Wabanaki people, the creation of then, again, that as an institution, reflecting our confederacy and our ability to work together on, with so many willing and amazing partners to introduce legislation and lobby and do all the kind of work. I would say that's the biggest piece of that. I think engaging in the education and mutual education in your communities and with your legislators, that's some of the work that the Alliance does. But I think really thinking deeply, just in hearing your question and Donna's response just now, just how that idea of fear still dictates a decision around our rights and our sovereignty. I mean, it's not just fear. I mean, I think, to me, sovereignty is also built upon trust. And, and the sort of indigenous traditions around it, again, interrelationship, not, responsibility, not rights so much, right? Those ideas of trust, when someone says, we're not recognizing your sovereignty, they mean we don't trust you. Whatever reason the governor or whoever else doesn't want us to exercise our own ability to be free and have our own futures dictated by us, that is I hear it as a way of saying, I just don't trust you. And, that's part of the broken piece of this. And I know, she negotiates with the tribes, and the Alliance has a really big part of that, and things have happened, but I can't help but hear it as, I don't trust you. And then you start to go down the road of, is it because we're the merciless savages or not? I think that's I'm not calling anyone anything, by the way. I'm just saying, I can't help but make those connections because it feels like they just don't trust us.
That reminds me, at a committee meeting, I was not, well, actually I was. I was working, advising the governor at that time, but we were sitting in on this judiciary committee meeting, and one of the responses from it was the Attorney General, when we talked about having sovereign recognition, and we wanted this sovereignty bill passed. The Attorney General, Assistant Attorney General, said, and I'm telling you, I could hardly keep my mouth shut. He said, well, if the tribes get sovereign rights, then they'll be able to pollute our waters. I'm honest. I'm telling you the truth.
So on that note, I'm going to go.
Well, no, I just to add to that.
True.
No, that's great, because I was going to follow-up question. But go ahead.
But you hear that, but then you also hear what the tribes will do will be too environmentally protective.
Yep.
And you can only think about both of those concepts if someone is dehumanized. You can only put both of those ideas that we are both going to pollute and then overly restrictive environments if you're dehumanizing them. Because that's in the morass of ideas.
So, good question from the audience. Referenced Western tribes and the full sovereignty that's exercised in some parts of the United States that's not fully recognized here. I'm curious, there's a lot of fear that we're referencing, fear of what the tribes will do here if they are able to exercise the kind of sovereignty that's exercised elsewhere. But I'm curious if either of you could comment on how do you think that the exercise of sovereignty, what would be the exercise here? And what are the priorities that tribes are focused on elsewhere that would be important for the tribes here that would enrich not just the communities, the tribal communities, but the state as a whole? Any thoughts on how we would exercise that sovereignty?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, first of all, we would be exercising it within our tribal court system. We've had to beg the state of Maine to pass the Violence Against Women's Act. We have women on our tribal communities that are beaten up and raped, and sometimes we see that the state courts don't really pay that much attention to it. The surrounding law enforcement officers, no, not so much. And I know because I used to be a police chief. So the other thing too is, we're stopped at everything we try to do economically. If you go to any of these tribal communities, there's no infrastructure. No infrastructure. We're kept poor on purpose. And we can get out from under that. We don't have the same chances to advance as federal tribes do. And because there's such a fear of us being able to be self-sufficient.
Yeah, I mean, I think just picking up, the two things that come to my mind are economic and environment. I would say economic, the Harvard report gives a very good set of details around what are we currently barred from that is preventing our incomes from matching the other tribes in terms of within our communities, but also it's not just an outlay of federal dollars. It is the ability to contract, compact, and make those dollars go further, being able to build our own infrastructures. Like that's what we're prevented from doing because of the Settlement Act. So, and they go into a very good description of that. And then I would say also and most critically, that's also it's not keeping just tribal communities more impoverished, it's keeping the other non-tribal peoples living near them also down and not able to benefit economically from the kinds of things that tribes in other parts of the country are able to do, which it boggles my mind politically that they're so afraid of our sovereignty. They're also saying Mainers, non-tribal Mainers, the poorest parts of our state should also continue to be, poor forever because we're afraid of this thing. And then the other thing is, environmentally, is the infrastructure of, and this is, Corey's actually by far the biggest expert on other tribes and their sovereignty of the panel, but I know enough, wrote my dissertation about the treatment as a state kind of framework around our ability of our tribes to set our own environmental standards and enforce them in a cooperative way with both federal and state partners. It's not a big scary thing, it's a whole process, but it also ensures, I think, our caretaking responsibilities as tribal peoples and the beauty of Maine, and that would help preserve it for everyone, not just Native people for the next 7 generations. So I'm baffled again, because those are both two things, economy and environment, that our sovereignty would actually really help the entirety of people here in the state of Maine with.
That's great. Thank you. Well, we're at the top of the hour, and so I don't know if either of you have another couple of words that you want to say to close, a parting thought, a book recommendation, but you've got the floor one more time.
Okay,
Donna.
I do. There's an article that I co-wrote with Judge Eric Menert and Attorney Joseph Gauss, and it's called One Nation Under Fraud. And it's in the law review. They accepted it as an article, and we had
Maine law.
yes, I'm sorry, Maine law, and we had a symposium on it, right? With other papers that were being brought. So look, you can Google that, One Nation Under Fraud. So that's another resource I would recommend, and I'm not trying to be self-serving here, is the Wabanaki Windows radio show, and it's archived on WERU, and there are about 110 shows, and they're an hour long, and on any issue, any tribal issue you want to hear about, go to that radio station and listen to it. Those are my radio shows. I've done a series on sovereignty. I've done one on isolation, control, and elimination. And I'm doing one now on hidden elements. So, there you go.
I would read One Nation Under Fraud and the Wabanaki Windows. I would say, in addition to really supporting Wabanaki Alliance, also supporting the work that we're doing, I think it's related to these issues in around land return and rematriation work with the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship. Find our website, dawnlandreturn.org, and it's, I think, faced with the challenges with the state, it's one way that we're making a really positive change around our ability to be sovereign and in that way access lands taken from us, having maintaining and reimagining our caretaking and stewardship responsibilities to these places that are coming back into tribal control. So, in addition to what Donna just mentioned. Thank you so much.
Thank you. One final thing for me before we say our final thanks. Other than supporting the Wabanaki Alliance and the rematriation of our ancestors and our land, I would ask people to support the Haudenosaunee Nationals' quest to compete in the 2028 Summer Olympics. When we talk about the exercise of sovereignty, the ability of a nation to represent its people at the Olympics is one of the most clear present examples of that in modern times. And the Haudenosaunee Nationals are the embodiment of our Indigenous sovereignty at the Olympic stage. So support them, support the Creators Game. Thank you for being here. G'chi Waliwan, safe travels. Upchich.